Okay, I suppose we can start, and then people who are joining can are free to join midway. So I welcome you to this problem solving and live interaction for the course Experimental Stress Analysis. Today the topic of discussion will be from the contents of week 5 of the course, which has to do with circular polariscope and compensation. So before we start solving the problems, if there are any questions, what we have discussed, please you can bring them up now. Otherwise, we can take it. We can start looking at the questions and we can take it from there. Okay, so I take it that it is clear. So let us look at the first question today. In the bright field arrangement of a circular polariscope, the intensity becomes zero when the retardation is which of the following is what is asked. So we have looked at this in detail in the last class also. For example, we can analyze this using Jones calculus. Which is basically nothing but a matrix representation of optical elements. I should say matrix representation and operation to be correct. Representation and of optical elements. So we saw that the general form of any retarder, any optical element basically introduces a retardation as well as a rotation. So we saw that conveniently it can be represented, any retarder matrix can be represented as cos delta by 2 minus I sin delta by 2 cos 2 theta, then minus I sin delta by 2 sin 2 theta. This is a symmetric matrix, and this also we have, but for the sign it will be the same. So we saw that this is the general representation. So if we were to basically, I'm sorry, 1 minute. So in case of a circular polariscope, we know that we have a polarizer, and then we have a quarter wave plate, which I'll represent like that. We can represent it like that with the fast and slow axis. Call this the datum, this being the same coordinate. Then we have some model. Then we have a crossed second quarter wave plate with slow and fast. And then we have the analyzer. Analyzer can be placed either way, whether horizontal or vertical. So if we were to look at the Jones calculus for circular polariscope, so first we have, let us say, our, and I am taking some unit intensity to be impinging, to be the light input, and then we have our first polarizer. Let us say that our first quarter wave plate has a slow axis aligned at 135 degrees. So we saw that its representation comes to 1I, I1. Then we have our general retardation matrix. This we will consider to be representing the model which we are looking at. So this entire thing has accounted for the polarizer, the first quarter wave plate, the model. And then we have our second quarter wave plate. Let us say it is at 45. So it will be minus I1. And then whatever be the input light, before impinging on the analyzer, we have the light vector in place. Now it is only a matter of which is the component we are trying to look at. So this is quarter wave plate 2. This is the model or specimen, whatever we call it. This is quarter wave plate 1 and this is the polarizer. Now we saw that conditions for light extinction basically depends on output light vector. So in the case of plane polariscope, we saw that our output light vector basically has, in the case of plane polariscope, our output light vector was light input sine square 2 theta sine square delta by 2. So it could be, the light could be extinguished, which meaning it could form a fringe where it could be parallel to the principal stress direction at that point. Otherwise, it could also be so when the light is passing as a full wave plate, meaning that we are having sine square delta by 2 equal to 0, which happens when we have integer retardations, meaning the model behaves like a full wave plate at those particular points. This is the case of a plane polariscope. But we saw that there is a difficulty because isoclinics and isochromatics both will get superimposed over one another, and we cannot distinguish between the two unless we have some different light source or we load it slowly. There are certain methodologies with which we can distinguish, but for quantitative analysis, it is always better to have them separated. So one way to separate that out is we take out the directional dependence. This has the directional dependence. For fringe formation. This has the retardation naturally. Retardation is again sigma 1 minus sigma 2 is directly related to that. So that is essentially a magnitude magnitude dependence, we can say. So to solve this issue, what we did was we put a circular polariscope arrangement wherein we introduced two quarter wave plates in between the polarizer and the analyzer, so that the directional dependence is taken care of. In such a case, what happens is when we have a circular polariscope, so now in plane polariscope we only had one arrangement, meaning that our polarizer and analyzer necessarily need to be crossed. Otherwise, we will be only seeing everything, the input light that is coming, and we won't be able to see any discernible fringes. But this is not the case in a circular polariscope. So it depends on how you are placing the analyzer, whether it is parallel to the polarizer or whether it is kept crossed with the polarizer. Crossed meaning at 90 degrees. So for a circular polariscope which is crossed, I see crossed, we see that our input light sine square delta by 2 would be, if we multiply it out using Jones calculus, this is what we will get as meaning this entire thing, and we can find out if we are keeping the polarizer at 90 degree, we will keep the analyzer at 0 degree. That is what crossed combination means. So the real part of the x component of the output light vector, if we analyze, it will come out to be I input sine square delta by 2. Similarly, if we keep it parallel, it will come out to be sine square, cos square delta by 2. So this is basically known as a dark field arrangement. And the other one is known as a bright field arrangement. Why is because when we have a model, if our field of view is somewhat greater than the model, then we will be able to see from the background the light that is coming, that is not crossing the model but from the background place, whatever light we will be getting through the circular polariscope, if we keep it in a crossed combination of polarizer and analyzer, and given that the quarter wave plates are crossed, then we will be able to see that the light gets extinguished. So it will be a dark field, the field is dark. Whereas if we were to keep the analyzer and polarizer parallel with the cross quarter wave plate combinations, then we will be able to see the background light getting passed, which is nothing but the white bright field combination, bright field arrangement. So with this background, if we reapproach this question, in the bright field arrangement of a circular periscope, the intensity becomes zero when the retardation is what? Is what is asked. So essentially what we are asking is when will this go to zero? So I input cos square delta by 2 will go to 0 when delta by 2 is either pi by 2 or 3 pi by 2 or 5 pi by 2 and so on. That is odd multiples, which implies how is the option given? Okay. So we can see here, basically we are looking at odd multiples of pi by 2, we can say. So it is m plus 1 by 2 pi by 2 is what we are looking if we take m to be integer, which is what is the constraint given in the question. So this happens to be 2m plus 1 into 2n plus 1 into pi by 4. Oh, I'm sorry, this will just be m plus 1 into pi. The when we get an integer, it is automatically considered there. So it will be essentially 2m plus 1 into pi. Yes, exactly. So we are able to see this will be the combination. For example, if we were to substitute, wait, 1 plus 1. Okay, why not we expand it out? I'm not very clear about this. So the first option gives us 0, pi, 2 pi, and so on. And we know that this is the case only for dark field arrangement. So the first is for dark field. So the second one actually is not dark field or bright field, because we'll be able to see 0, pi by 2, and then pi, and then 3 pi by 2. So this is basically not any field that we know of yet, because either it will be complementary, either it will be sine square delta by 2 or cos square delta by 2. So in such a case, we cannot have this happening. Option? Okay. No, option 4 also we'll see. Yeah, just a moment. In option 3, if I were to substitute 0, 1, 2, 3, then I'll get 0, I'm sorry, pi, and then I'll get 3 pi, and then 5 pi, etc. for retardation. So if we see here, delta by 2 is pi by 2, 3 pi by 2, 5 pi by 2, and so on. So delta essentially has to be pi, 3 pi, 5 pi, and so on. So we are able to see that option C, yeah, actually I had indeed correctly identified it. Okay, option C is the correct one. Option D, if we expand it out, it is nothing but even this thing. So it is 0, it is 2 pi, then it is 4 pi, and so on. So we don't have cos square delta by 2 going to 0 at that point, which is why C happens to be the correct retardation multiples where we will see a fringe, meaning that light intensity would go to 0. So if there are any questions, please do ask. Okay, I hope that this is clear. I stretched it out a little bit towards the end. Basically, the essence is either sine square delta by 2 goes to 0, which happens to be dark field, or cos square delta by 2 goes to 0, which happens to be bright field. The question is asking about delta and not delta by 2. So that is where the confusion was initially. Now we are able to see that these are complementary. Meaning in one arrangement, if we see a dark spot somewhere, in the other arrangement, if we were to keep the analyzer parallel instead of crossed, the dark spot will become the brightest. So essentially these form complementary fringes. Another interesting thing we are able to see is that if we want fringes at every half, if we want every half fringe, meaning 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, and so on, can we do anything with the arrangement that we will be able to get those fringes? Essentially, if we were to take one image of a dark field arrangement and a bright field arrangement, we know that these are complementary fringes. By fringe processing, if we are able to determine the fringe order at every point. So if we subtract a bright field image from a dark field image, we are able to see that cos square delta by 2 minus sine square delta by 2 essentially gives us, it is cos 2 theta. Cos square theta minus sine square theta is cos 2 theta. So it is nothing but cos square delta. So this is basically referred to as mixed field. So we will be able to get this by subtracting one image from the other, but the constraint is that the image should be exactly aligned. So during the course of taking one image and the other image, there shouldn't be any movement. Otherwise, it will not get exactly superimposed. So this is just some additional information I just wanted to highlight it. So essentially, we can see that in the bright field arrangement, the light intensity becomes 0 when retardation is 2m plus 1 multiples of pi. Okay, so let us look at the next question. Answer true or false for the following statements in some particular format, FT, FFT, whatever that is. So a calibration of a polariscope is necessary step in digital photoelasticity. Yes, this is very much required in digital photoelasticity since we are going for quantitative whole field measurement. What this requires is that in order to get the handedness and everything in place, so that these we can perform something called phase shifting methods, we need to initially calibrate the polariscope. So this is very much necessary. Then the error introduced due to mismatch of a quarter wave plate is minimal if the quarter wave plates are kept crossed. Yes, research has essentially, yes, it is true. Basically, what is the source of this error? Source of this error is, we saw that our retardation is some function of the thickness of the plate and the wavelength. It could be the inverse, the reciprocal of this also. You can just revisit that formulation and see. Basically, this has something to do with the wavelength of light also. So what it means is, if we set the thickness of the sheet such that it introduces delta by 2, that is quarter wave retardation. If we want, quarter wave retardation means lambda by 4 retardation we will get for a particular wavelength of light. Now, if we purchase from commercial suppliers, that quarter wave plate would have been calibrated for one particular wavelength of light. It is not necessary that the light that you are using in your laboratory in the photoelastic bench is necessarily matching with that. Hence, there is a mismatch. So, we are saying that it is perfectly circularly polarized light, which is having uh, when we have a quarter wave plate, essentially our light ellipse gets aligned with our coordinate directions, and those coordinate directions we are placing it in such a way that light gets equally split between the fast and slow axis, which is what makes a circular light, circularly polarized light from linearly polarized light. Now, aligning it at for equal directions with the light vector is trivial and we have control over it. But to say that it is exactly introducing quarter wavelength retardation for this particular light, it is not in our control. Hence, this essentially leads to somewhat of an error. But that research, extensive research has been carried out, and it shows that when we keep the quarter wave plates crossed, meaning if the first one is at 45 degrees, keeping the second quarter wave plate at 135 or the other way around, basically lets us minimize this error, and not the noise propagation basically gets reduced. That is because the second quarter wave plate basically tries to nullify the effect what the first quarter wave plate is trying to bring. So yes, this is true. The fringe orders are always positive instead in case of a circular polariscope in both dark and bright field arrangements. Yes, exactly. This is false because we just saw that bright field arrangement basically gives multiples, half fringe orders, we can say. Let us just make it terse. So this gives us half fringe orders. So that is essentially not true. The output light intensity transmitted in the case of a dark field arrangement of a circular polariscope is a function of retardation and the amplitude of the intensity of the incident light vector. So we saw here that in case of our dark field arrangement, our output light intensity is a function of input light and sine square delta by 2, which is nothing but our retardation. So definitely this is true. So I hope that this is clear. If there are any questions, please do ask. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. Let us move to the next question. Different circular polariscope arrangements are given in the table. Identify the background as dark or bright. Enter D for dark and D for bright. D for bright in each of these cases. So the polarizer and analyzer are kept crossed and the quarter wave plates are kept parallel. So in arrangement 1, what will this be? Whether this will be dark or bright. This is what we are expected to answer for these 4 cases. So let us look at one sample case as to how we can. This is actually shown in the lecture, but if we were to take one, we'll just have a look at this. So if both are kept, if polarizer and analyzer are kept cross, let us say that my polarizer is kept at 90 degrees. And then let us say that my first quarter wave plate is kept at 135. Then I have my second quarter wave plate, because here I am looking at the background intensity, so I did not include the models matrix. So if I keep the quarter wave plates parallel, that implies that my second quarter wave plate is the same as the first, and my polarizer and analyzer is crossed. So I have to look at the essentially because this is the y component, I have to look at the x component. So if we were to see this, what will this come out to be? 1 So this will be I, this will be 1. This comes out to be 1 by 2 into I plus I. This is minus 1 plus 1 by 2. So this comes out as I and 0. So if I were to see the constraint for the first case is that these are crossed. And my polarizer for the first case is kept at 90 degrees. That is why I got 0, 1 as my vector. So if this is crossed, I'm able to see that I'm getting a zero intensity. That is, I'm getting this as the output light vector. Now I have to analyze what I'll get with whether I'll be getting a dark field or a bright field. So any guesses on what this is? We had one answer from someone. Dark, bright, dark, bright, bright, dark. Okay, so let us see. Essentially, we need to look at the x component, which means we have to look at the first component of this light vector. So Ex for this light vector is I. So if we look at Ex complement, it is 0 plus I into 0 minus I, which is 1. So what this implies is this is a bright field arrangement. It is not a dark field arrangement. So this is bright field. We sent in 1 and we are getting back 1. So in similar lines, if we see, we can derive the things for each and every combination. So is that clear? Are there any questions? Okay, so I take it that it is clear. Yeah, so in similar lines, we can derive for the rest also. Essentially, this will come out to be if both we kept it parallel, then what would it come out to be? Actually, I would like to show this with one software that is there in our. I'll just 1 minute stop presenting here and I'll present my screen from here. Okay, so I hope my screen is visible. So this is one software that we have, in-house developed software, which is nothing but a virtual laboratory. So for example, if I were to look at the problem of a disk, let me say that this is the problem of a disk and this is my circular polariscope arrangement. Now I'll put the polarizer, let me put it at 90. Let us look at the first option and confirm that what we are doing is correct. We put it at 90 from our discussion. The second quarter wave plate, we had used 1I, so it was at 135 only. The third quarter wave plate was kept parallel to this, so that was also at 135. And since the polarizer and analyzer would qualify to be crossed, since polarizer is at 90, I've kept my analyzer at 0. And let me see what I'm getting. So we are able to see that the background intensity, the points at these points outside of the disk are basically bright. So whatever light that is coming as input, it is getting out faithfully like that. Which is why we are getting a bright field. Now, just let us look at the second question that was asked. When both are kept parallel, let me say that my polarizer is kept at 90. To make it parallel, my analyzer also should be at 90, and my first and second quarter wave plate are at 135. Now, if I apply, I'll be able to see whether it is bright field or dark field. Now, I can see that the place outside of the disk, it has essentially become dark because this is a dark field arrangement. This particular arrangement leads to a dark field configuration. So this is something I just wanted to show. This has been done based on Jones calculus only. So one could also attempt it this way. So I hope that this is clear. So I'll just present back my screen. So this software is called T-Scope, and I had included that in one of the earlier sessions also towards the end in order to explain the isoclinic and isochromatic formation. So this is being developed at Digital Photomechanics Lab at IIT Madras. So in similar vein, one can derive that this is dark, this is also dark, and this is bright. So I leave it to you to try this thing out once, and if there are any questions, you can approach. So this has to be done in a similar manner. Okay. So let us look at the next question. The given figure indicates the isochromatics obtained in the case of a crack subjected to mode 1 loading. So just not that it matters, but I'll just give you a brief of what essentially they mean by mode 1. So if I have a specimen like this, and if I'm applying load, and if I were to have a small crack here, if I zoom into this place, how this would look is, I am exaggerating that the crack has opened here. So essentially this is the kind of isochromatics I get in the case of a crack. So I'm able to see that at this point, which is nothing but this point, the crack tip, the stresses are extremely high, which is reflected by the red color, which means it is not captured by this color table, which implies that the fringe order there is much, much higher. Okay, now we are trying to look at 2 points. One point is essentially here and the other is here. Using the color code given, identify the fringe orders rounded to the nearest integer at these 2 points, A and B. Now, if I zoom in, I'm able to see that at point A, wherever this is marked, my color is more or less black. So this is one advantage we get when we use white light for photoelasticity, because we are able to see colored fringes. This also helps in analyzing the experimental images using a method called total fringe order photoelasticity, which essentially deals with some statistics and searching through a calibrated color table and arriving at the fringe orders at that point. And there are many challenges to it, so there has been a lot of research that has gone into it. Okay, so we know that at point A, we are essentially having black. If we were to see this color table, we can see that black only indicates a fringe order of 0. So we are clearly able to see that at point A, fringe order n which is delta by 2 pi, is nothing but 0. So if we analyze this table, we are able, this is nothing but delta in nanometers, whatever retardation that was. And this has been based on a wavelength of 577 nanometers, which is approximately the wavelength of green light, which happens to be in the middle of white light, you can say. So when will my fringe order be 1? When delta by 2 pi is 1. Now, one wavelength for 577 nanometers, when my, if I express this in terms of wavelength, then my retardation has to be 577 nanometers for me to get the fringe order 1, which we are able to see here clearly. That is when we will be getting the first fringe order. Similarly, the second fringe order would be when it is the second multiple of that, approximately. Okay, so having done this, if we look at this fringe, we are able to see that yeah, Mr. Rajamanar, you have any question? Tint of passage essentially is not a color, but it will give you a relation between these two, the lesser and the greater one out of that. So wherever the color passes from dull red to blue, we are able to see that passage indicates a fringe order of 1. So yeah, we can see from this image, we can see that this is black, then we have somewhat whitish, then it goes towards red and then going to blue. So if we see from our color table, black to gray, white, then orange, dull red to blue. So this is exactly the kind of variation we are able to see here, or here for that matter. So if this point happens to be black, if this is 0, then this fringe, which I'm highlighting now, this fringe happens to be fringe order 1. Because in conventional photoelasticity, we can take our calibration table and we can try to match the colors in order to arrive at the fringe orders. But now, if we were to replace our human eye with a camera and then acquire the image and then run many algorithms through it, then we will be exactly able to identify at each and every pixel of that image what the fringe order is. So that is what I had meant by the total fringe order photoelasticity. There has been a lot of publications by our professor also in this area, and it is a well-established, robust methodology in order to arrive at total fringe orders for the whole field information. But since we are right now learning the nuts and bolts of it, it is easy for us to identify this based on some colors that we have. It is a subjective call. We also know that, but to appreciate what has been achieved now, we have to understand some things from the basics. That is the idea behind this. Is it clear, sir? Uh, yeah, okay. So here we are able to see from black to gray to white to red to blue we are going. So we are able to see it is falling in the same line, and at from dull red to blue we are able to see that it has a fringe order of 1. So this line which I have actually marked, this line, let me mark it in yellow, that line is essentially fringe order 1. In the same line, if I know the physics of the problem, I can see that my stresses will shoot up as I go near the crack tip. This is for known problems. So essentially, since we are dealing with continuum mechanics, I know that if this is 1, this is 2, the next tint of passage has to be 3, and so on. I can go on counting. This is possible because first thing, we have a colored image. Second, we have the color calibration table with us, and we know, and it is for a known problem. Now, in case we had a monochromatic image, we will just be seeing black bands at all these points. At all these points, we will be just seeing black bands because the light is getting extinguished at those points. In such a case, it is essential for us to know the fringe gradient, in which direction the fringe increases, and at least fringe order at least one point in the domain. Yes, every point in the fringe will be 0, which means that we will be seeing only black and white. Yes, combination of black and white only we will be seeing. So these fringes will be black. In between, the places in between these will be white. So it will just be black and white bands, in which case we will not be able to discern one fringe from the other. So we cannot tell fringe order based on a black and white image unless we know, yeah, white light, white light. Yes, okay, yeah. If we use, okay, now it will be again some other calibration table you will get in such a case. So with that calibration, at least you will see some colored response in that case, but it may not be exactly as colorful as this. In such a case, you will have to essentially develop a color calibration for that and from a known problem and compare it against this. This calibration table we are seeing here on the right, this has been developed for a pure bending case. Without any shear, we know that pure bending essentially gives only lines with which we are able to see, we are able to discern easily from which line to which line what are the color variations. So this is how color calibration tables are generated. So the quality and accuracy of the information that you can discern out of an isochromatic image essentially depends on the light source that you have used, the knowledge of the problem that you have. Knowledge of the problem meaning that you should know at least the fringe order at one point in the domain and the fringe gradient and the color calibration that you have done. But for monochromatic light, there is no color calibration. Essentially, you will be seeing only black and white bands, in which case you would have to supplement that with some colored this thing, or maybe as it is said in the lecture also, you start loading the problem slowly so that you know how the fringe evolution is taking place. So these are some of the challenges which needs to be kept in mind while attempting experiments. So if this is 1, this is 2, then we are able to see that from rose red to green, from rose red to green, we are able to see that here we are having pinkish to green. So this fringe essentially is nothing but our fringe order 2. Fringe order is 2, which means delta is 2 times the retardation. The whatever wavelength we are getting, 2 times of that is what the retardation is. So our fringe order is 2. So at point B, our fringe order is 2. Now this doesn't mean that we cannot discern the we know that if this is fringe order 1 and if this is fringe order 2, from continuum mechanics we know that fringe order in between are real numbers between 1 and 2. How to identify them is a matter of compensation that we will be seeing in the subsequent questions also. So I hope that this is clear. If there are any questions, please do ask. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. So let us look at this question. The figure shows the generic schematic representation of a circular polariscope. Different regions are indicated using Roman numerals along the light path. 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, and 6 we have. Assume that the light path indicated in the figure is passing through fringe order 1. Why we have gone for this assumption is something we need to understand first. Choose the correct state of polarization of light at each region. Enter it based on the alphabet. They have given some options. P stands for plane polarized, E is elliptical, C is circular, U is unpolarized light. So from our initial knowledge, what we can say now, between the light source and the polarizer, the light is unpolarized. In region 1, we have unpolarized light, which is precisely why we are going for a polarizer, so that we have control over the input light in order to study our specimens. So that is pretty clear. Now, since we have passed that unpolarized light through a plane polarizer, we know that in region 2, our light is polarized, plane polarized essentially. So it is coming at 90 degrees. Now, once it passes through a quarter wave plate, it has got a retardation of uh, 1/4 of the wavelength. Now, once that happens, we know that our light ellipse has aligned with our coordinate axis, and the coordinate axis has been placed in such a way we have our light vector like that, that is input, the light vector impinging on the first quarter wave plate, and this has been placed at 135 degrees. It is given. What that implies is it gets equally distributed to fast and slow axis. So when we have a retardation of delta pi by 4, pi by 2, and we have equal components along the fast and slow axis, essentially we get nothing but a circularly polarized light, which we saw in detail using our light ellipse discussion. So we have a circularly polarized light in this region. Now what will be the nature of light that will be leaving the model is something that is important and needs to be understood thoroughly. We know that integer fringe order only comes when we have, that is, if the fringe order is an integer and it has been given that the fringe order is 1. This implies that delta by 2 pi is 1. This implies that our delta is 2 pi, which means our model at that point, because of the stresses induced in that model, the model is behaving like a full wave plate, which means it is just passing the light unaltered just by retardation of one entire wavelength, which is why our light here will remain unaltered in that sense. It will still be circularly polarized. If this was not fringe order 1, but if we were looking at some other point where the fringe order was some integer, this implies that our light that comes out of that model will become an ellipse and not essentially a circularly polarized light. So once this happens, we have another quarter wave plate that nullifies that difference, and we have again the fifth one, we have a plane polarized light. Polarized light in the fifth region. Now we just saw that we have kept the first and second quarter wave plate crossed because this is at 45. The slow axis is at 45 here and it is at 135 degrees here. So the first and second quarter wave plates are crossed, and our polarizer and analyzer are kept crossed here because polarizer is at 90 degree and analyzer is at 0 degree. So we know that this is a dark field arrangement. Dark field arrangement, we know based on our knowledge of uh, Jones calculus. We have seen it in the first question also. What is the condition for light extinction? And we know that this arrangement will essentially give us a dark field arrangement. Okay, now our model is behaving like a full wave plate over there. In which case, it is not essentially changing anything in the light, but for introducing a retardation. In which case, the light that we see after this will be plane polarized. So it will be plane polarized. So is this clear? Are there any questions? Okay, so I take it that this is clear. Essentially, this is just an amalgamation of what we have discussed so far. First, it becomes unpolarized. Then, in one region, we want to have control over it, so we introduced a polarizer, and we had an analyzer and a model in between. But it was giving two types of fringes: one because of retardation, and one because of directional dependence. So, in order to eliminate that directional dependence, we brought in quarter wave plates, and we have kept them crossed so as to minimize the error. So once the quarter wave plates are kept crossed and the polarizer and analyzer combinations are kept crossed, we are able to analyze the effect response at any point based on our Jones matrix. And we are given that retardation that has been introduced is nothing but one wavelength because the fringe order there is one. Based on this, for this arrangement, we can write Jones calculus and we will be able to easily discern what is the nature of light in each and every region. So I take it that this is clear. So let us move to the next question. The steps involved in Babinet-Soleil compensation technique are given below. Arrange these steps in the correct sequential order. Enter the alphabets in the order without any space. For example, if you thought that the order is this, then that is how you're supposed to report it. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Because essentially, you have undone the in first region it is unpolarized, then it becomes linearly polarized, became circularly polarized, and since our model it introduced only one wavelength difference, essentially nothing changed in the circular light. It was still circular, which got undone by the second quarter wave plate. It became linear and it easily passes through our analyzer. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the steps involved in this compensation we are supposed to report in this method. Now, just to give you a brief of what compensation essentially is. Compensation is nothing but we are trying to compensate for the residual retardation. That is, we are trying to see that if we have a specimen and it was loaded at some point, let me take a disk and explain. If these are two fringes and then one of the fringes like that. Consider that these two are fringes. Now, somewhere in between, if I want to find out the fringe order from, let us say, from some source, I know that this is fringe order 1 and this happens to be fringe order 2. Now, from continuum mechanics, I know that the fringe order at that point, let me call that A. So, NA, it belongs somewhere between 0 and 1, 1 and 2. Now, that is for sure. But we don't know exactly what that value is, in which case we will have to arrive at methods to identify the fringe order at that point. Now, as soon as we come to compensation, so we have to introduce some retardation there so that it becomes a known behavior for us. What is a known behavior? A fringe formation is a known behavior. So we will be introducing artificial retardation at that very point till we know a fringe order, a known fringe passes through that point. We know what we have introduced into the problem and we know what the final response is. Once we subtract out what we have introduced, we will be getting what ideally the fringe order is at that point. This is the basic principle behind compensation techniques. as soon as we say that we are going for compensation, since we are introducing artificially at that point, it essentially becomes a point by point technique. It is no longer whole field. Although it has been emphasized in the lecture also, although when we go for compensation, we will be seeing fringes at other locations apart from our point of interest also. These essentially do not have any physical meaning. It is very essential to understand this before we start the procedure. So this compensation can be done using external equipments like Babinet-Soleil compensator, which was shown in the lecture also. Essentially, this is a glass plate with a uh, with a graduated rotating ring, where once we rotate it, the thickness of the glass increases in such a way that it starts introducing artificial retardation at that point of interest. Later, it was found with the strength of Jones calculus that we can achieve the same result. Instead of having external elements, we can simply rotate the analyzer and we will be able to find the integer fractional fringe order at that point. This was developed and this is called the Tardy's method of compensation. But in the interest of covering it in a comprehensive way, the lecture also covered this compensator and then went to Tardy's method of compensation. Okay, so the first and foremost requirement for this uh, compensation to take place is that we should identify the isoclinic angle at that point. Why? Because all our Jones calculus everywhere, you would have seen that fast and slow axis, everything that we have given is with respect to the fast and slow axis have been taken as the basis. So in such a case, we should know the isoclinic angle where the fast and slow axis essentially is with respect to our coordinate system. Once we know that at a point, we will be able to write the Jones matrix multiplication and arrive at what is the light characteristics at that point. If we did not know that, then we are not sure at what angle we are taking. Because for a general retarder, we wrote that cos delta by 2 minus I sin delta by 2 cos 2 theta. That theta is essentially, we are assuming that to be the slow axis direction with respect to our coordinate basis. So that is a prerequisite for us to apply that Jones calculus, which is why the first and foremost requirement in case of compensation techniques is that you should know the isoclinic angle at that point. Once you know that, you arrange the entire thing in that way. We will be seeing it will be a little different for this Babinet-Soleil compensation as against Tardy's method of compensation. But the idea remains the same, that since our mathematics analysis is based on a known theta p, the entire thing is presumed to be arranged at theta p. We should first, at that point, we should first arrive at theta p, arrange everything there, and then go for it. Okay, so let us read the options now. Introduce compensation by rotating the knob until the fringe order reaches that point. Determine the isoclinic angle at that point. Consider an arbitrary point where the fringe order has to be determined. Obtain the fringe order with null balance compensator calibration graph. Note down the counter reading. Orient the compensator. So essentially, although the first step is finding out the isoclinic angle, we must know where we have to find out the isoclinic angle. So naturally, C, our consider an arbitrary point where we want to find, happens to be the first option. So once we have found the arbitrary point, we should first determine the isoclinic angle at that point, which is given in B. Now that we have, using a plane polariscope arrangement, we have determined the isoclinic angle at that point. Once we have done this, I'll just cross these out so that there is no duplication. Once we have done this, then we are trying to find with that extent this Babinet-Soleil compensator, we will have to align this at that point in that isoclinic angle. If we got our isoclinic angle to be 40 degrees, then at that point of interest A, I will align my equipment at 40 degrees with respect to my X, and then try to rotate the knob and bring that fringe there. So essentially, we have to orient this first. Once this is done, I will introduce a retardation. How? Introduce a retardation by rotating the knob. This was also shown. Like once we rotate it, the glass becomes thicker and it introduces artificial retardation into the problem of known quantity. So once we introduce this, and we see that our obtain, we see that the fringe will move and exactly pass through that point of interest. So once this happens, obtain the fringe order from the null balance compensator. No. This until a fringe reaches the point of interest that is covered in that point itself. I had misread it. What point I says is you just keep rotating the knob till the fringe order of your interest reaches that point. Once that is done, you just note down the counter reading. It will give you some reading from that graduated scale in that compensator. Once you note that down, you just draw it against the graph that they have provided along with this compensator. There will be a calibration graph that will be provided, where when you enter the reading, the y-intercept will give you the fractional fringe order at that point. So once you do this, let me say that this is 1 and this is 2. I align my compensator like that, knowing fully well that its angle is some theta, and I have aligned this at theta. I've rotated it. So let us say that my first fringe order moved to that point, and the reading from which the graph, when I compare the reading from the graduated scale to the graph, I'll be able to see the fractional fringe order that will be. Let us say that it will be the fractional fringe order is 0.4. So I know that the fringe order here, a priori, I know that it is in the range of 1 to 2. And I know that my first fringe order has moved, that n equal to 1 has moved at that point. So essentially, I'll be adding this to n in order to get my total fringe order of 1.4. If I were to rotate it in some other way, the second fringe order would have come to that point. In which case, for that same point, considering this to hold, if this holds, then 0.6 would have been the reading which I would have got. Because 1 point, given a problem, 1 point can have only one fringe order, come what may, no matter which fringe approach is there. So that is the kind of test we are trying to do. So this is the procedure for Babinet-Soleil compensation. This seems to be rather cumbersome, because of which there were researchers who looked into the Jones matrix representation and found that we can instead do it very easily by conducting the Tardy's method of compensation. So that we will be seeing next. So if there are any questions here, please feel free to ask. If it is clear, we'll move on to the next question. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. But before this, I just wanted to just mention one more thing about how to find the isoclinic angle. We have seen from this, once given the isoclinic, how to arrive at the integer fractional fringe order and how to add it and get the total fringe order at that point, that we have understood. But essentially, how will we arrive at the isoclinic angle is a question that it is just that if we have a polariscope here, so we will have to arrive at this angle using a plane polariscope, because plane polariscope happens to be the only arrangement where we see isoclinics. So let us say that I have my plane polariscope like this. This is at 90 degree and this is at 0 degree. This is my polarizer, this is my analyzer, and I have a model. And let us say this is my point of interest. And the isoclinic there, let us consider that the fast and slow axes are like this. And this angle happens to be theta p. This is nothing but, for the sake of explanation, let me take this to be some 35 degrees. So now when I see in this arrangement, with this being at 0, with the analyzer being at 0, I know that from my plane polariscope arrangement, IP is nothing but I in sine square 2 theta sine square delta by 2. So I'll be seeing both kind of fringes, isoclinic and isochromatic fringes. If I just ignore the isochromatic fringes for the time being and focus on the isoclinic fringes, then what I'll see is at this point, wherever theta is 0, all those points will appear black because sine square 2 theta goes to 0. What this essentially means is, howsoever I have oriented my uh, analyzer and polarizer crossed combination, that gives me that particular uh, isoclinic angle. Let us say in one arrangement I start rotating this. I just remove this. This is no longer 90 and this is no longer 0, but I keep it at some angle. Let this angle be some 100 degrees instead of 90, and I keep my analyzer at 10 degrees. It is still crossed, which is a requirement for me to see isoclinics. So this is at 10 degrees. Now it will show another set of bands where my isoclinic angle is 10 degree. Similarly, if I keep rotating these polarizer analyzer crossed combination, I'll see that at one point in time the fringe would pass this point of interest. Essentially, since we know the by way of posing the question that our theta p at that point is 35 degrees. Essentially, when I move the polarizer and analyzer crossed combination to 35 degrees, I'll be able to see that the fringe would pass through that point. This is how I determine that the isoclinic angle at that point is 35 degrees. Now, when I rotate polarizer and analyzer crossed combination, will I be seeing any movement in the isochromatics? No, actually, I will not be seeing once I rotate. Once polarizer analyzer crossed combination is rotated, only theta p will change. Essentially, the uh, retardation will not change at any point. So isoclinics will move and isochromatics will stay in place. This is another way to distinguish between isoclinics and isochromatics, as we saw in the last lectures or last sessions also. So this is how I will arrive at my uh, theta p. Essentially, the principal stress direction, the isoclinic angle at my point of interest, initially I have to arrive at in order to do the compensation. And this is how I will remove the quarter wave plates. I'll just have the specimen there loaded, and I'll try to rotate the analyzer and polarizer crossed combination till the isoclinic fringes passes through that point. From there, I'll find out the isoclinic angle. Now, in order to conduct the compensation, I'll introduce the quarter wave plates again. Having done that, I will place my Babinet-Soleil compensator at 35 degrees at that point and start rotating the knob till one of the known fringe orders moves through that point. I'll see which fringe order has moved. I'll take a note of that, and based on my understanding of whether the fringe order there is more or less, I will find the fractional fringe order and accordingly add it or subtract it from the integer fringe order that moved there in order to arrive at the total fringe order at that point, which happens to be some real number instead of an integer. So I hope that this is clear. I just wanted to brief on this also as to how we will find the isoclinic angle in order to conduct the compensation. So if there are any questions, please feel free to raise them now. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. So with this, let us get the next question. In order to determine the fringe order at any arbitrary point, After determining the isoclinic angle using a plane polariscope, a circular polariscope is formed in such a way that polarizer is kept at the isoclinic angle and all other elements are arranged appropriately. The analyzer alone is then rotated clockwise in the direction of beta until the fringe reaches the point of interest. This above method of compensation, in which analyzer itself is used as the compensator instead of the equipment which we saw earlier, is called which of the following? So it is nothing but yes, exactly. So it is Tardy's method of compensation, where instead of using separate equipment for that, our with the power of our Jones calculus, we can simply see that by rotating the analyzer, we are able to get it. This mathematically also we can see. Let us say that our point of interest has isoclinic angle as 0. Now, if I were to see my polarizer, let us say I have kept it is 0 and 90 only, so nothing changes. So I have kept this like that with my reference axis 0, 1. And then I have my first quarter wave plate, call it at 135. Then I have my model. Now what is my this thing? This will be cos delta by 2 minus I sine delta by 2 sine 0, because isoclinic angle I already know. And this all these cos 0, I'm sorry, cos 2 into 0, right? So cos 0 is 1. So essentially this matrix will water down to cos delta by 2 minus I sine delta by 2. This will be 0 because it has sine 2 theta components, and this will be the same. Then we have our analyzer. Then we have our second quarter wave plate. Now we have the analyzer. Let us say that I have kept the analyzer. I have rotated that by some beta degrees in the clockwise direction. Now beta in the clockwise implies that it is minus beta. So if I were to bring it back to the original this thing, I'll have to do that transformation. So it is nothing but cos beta. It will be my sine of minus beta minus sine of minus beta and cos beta. Once I multiply this out, I will get an expression which will be giving me the output light, the condition for output light when the fringe order will pass. This entire thing gives me one light intensity. Now the necessity for me is that the constraint for me here is that the light this will give me the light vector. Now for compensation, the constraint is that the light vector, let me call it LV, along that minus beta direction is 0. This will be my constraint because the fringe correctly passes through that point. Till that point I will rotate by minus beta. That is when I will get the fringe order exactly passing through that point. So if I impose this constraint after multiplying this out, I'll be able to see that I'll get a neat condition like this. So it will be tan delta by 2 is equal to tan beta, which implies that delta by 2 is plus or minus beta, because it could go either way. It could either be plus or minus. One thing to note here is that fractional fringe order can be negative also. As we saw, if the second fringe moves over that, my fractional fringe order in this case, if the first fringe moves, my fractional fringe order was 0.4. If the second fringe order moved to that point, my fractional fringe order was minus 0.6 essentially. So the fractional fringe order can invariably be negative. Once we add it to the integer fringe order which had moved to that point, we will get a positive quantity. That's a given because fringe order in photoelasticity is invariably positive, but same is not the case for fractional fringe orders. Okay, so once I rotate it by one angle, I'm able to see that uh, essentially I can find out by what angle I rotated and what is the retardation at that point. Once I get this is nothing but my fractional retardation. So once I get this, I'll be able to add it to the integer fringe order and get my total fringe order at that point. So if there are any questions, please ask. Yeah, yes, yes. So the question says to determine this, the arbitrary fringe order, the fringe order at an arbitrary point, you use the isoclinic angle first by the plane polariscope. Align the circular polariscope in that isoclinic angle. Once you do that, you just rotate the analyzer alone to arrive at beta. That is, you rotate the analyzer by beta till the fringe passes at that point, and you will be able to find what this thing is, what the fringe order is at that point. So if there are any questions, okay. So essentially what we saw is our fractional fringe order is my plus minus 2 beta. Now if we normalize it, my fractional fringe order delta r by 2 pi. Yeah. Is there any question, Mr. Rajamanar? Yeah, yeah. Okay. So if we normalize this, if I measure that in, let us say, degree, or I measure that in this thing itself. So my fractional fringe order nr is plus minus beta by pi, with the constraint being that beta is measured in radians. If that is measured in degree, it will be beta by 180 degrees. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. Okay, so let me move on to the next part. Yeah, essentially what we discussed here is repeated. So by Jones calculus, the intensity of light coming along the analyzer axis and perpendicular to it can be expressed as beta is the angle of rotation, clockwise angle of rotation essentially, and delta is the retardation that we obtained. So this is nothing but multiplying this out. We have multiplied this thing out. Okay, so why don't we do that? So I'll group this together. 1 by 2. This will be 1 minus I1, and then I'll have this thing. I'll have this thing here, and then here I'll just have I and 1. So this will come as it is, and then what I'll get here is I cos delta by 2 plus sine delta by 2, and this will be 0 cos delta by 2 minus I sine delta by 2. So this will be I cos delta by 2 plus sine delta by 2 minus I cos delta by 2 minus minus plus and then minus again minus sine delta by 2. 1 minute, if I'm doing this correctly. Cos delta by 2. Yeah, okay. It will be minus I cos delta by 2, only minus I. Yeah, cos delta by 2 minus I sine delta by 2 plus cos delta by 2. Yeah, I think there is a minus or plus floating around somewhere, which is causing the issue. You can work this out. So essentially it will come to sine delta by 2 cos delta by 2 in the numerator and denominator. And our rotation matrix, because we have rotated it clockwise, so it will be cos beta. It will be minus sine. It will be sine of minus beta, and then minus sine of minus beta, and this is cos beta. And this will give me sine delta by 2 cos delta by 2, and whatever is my input light. So that I needn't say here. So I'll just put it here. Okay, so this will be nothing but our cos beta minus sine beta cos beta, and this is sine delta by 2 cos delta by 2 and input light. So I can see that it is this option C. It is also discussed in the lecture in detail. So once we multiply this out, we get a constraint that tan 2 theta, this constraint we will get. Tan delta by 2 equal to tan beta, which implies that delta by 2 is beta. So that is how we will normalize it with the wavelength and get our fractional fringe order NR equal to plus or minus beta by pi or beta by 180, depending on how we have taken the measurement, whether in radians or degrees. Okay, so I take it that this is clear. So when I'll post this, I'll just go through this. Anyway, this has been discussed in detail in the lecture, how we got this. So you can also cross multiply it out, and you'll be able to see this is what we will be getting towards the end. So if there are any questions here, please do ask. Otherwise, we can move to the next question. Yeah, essentially, so our condition from our compensation for, yeah. So calculus, we can get tan, tan delta by 2 is nothing but tan beta, and that follows that delta is 2 beta. So I hope that this is clear. So let us look at the next question. if it is observed that a higher fringe order moves to the point of interest, then the fractional fringe order including its sign would be which one? Yeah. So we have already qualified that it is a higher fringe order, which implies that the fringe order at our point of interest is lower than what has moved. So if this is n moved, then n of our point of interest is nothing but n moved minus our nr, which is nothing but n moved. This is the fractional retardation. Minus beta by pi or 180 or howsoever we take it. Pi in degrees, let me call that. So, which is why it happens to be minus beta. So, when we do this Tardy's method of compensation, one way is if I rotate it one way, I'll be able to see that the lower fringe order goes to that point. If I rotate it the other way, the higher fringe order will come to that point. So, if I rotate clockwise by beta and I rotate anti-clockwise by beta dash, so this will be essentially equal to pi. That is my check. It exactly won't come to pi because it is a subjective call when the fringe crosses that point, because fringe is a band as we saw, and it is not exactly a line perceived by the eye. So when we take a call that at 30 degrees it would have moved, when we rotate it the other way, it would it would appear to cross that at maybe 151 degrees. So 151 plus 31, there will be a 1 degree discrepancy because of our perception. So the better way out is to make it statistically stable by doing it both ways. So in order to find the fringe order at that point, we will rotate it clockwise, anti-clockwise, and then arrive at two answers and average them out in order to get the total fringe order at that point. So that is the general way to go about this. Okay. So if the subsequent question is, if the lower fringe order moves, then what would be the thing? What would be the point of interest? It is the same thing except it will be plus. Exactly. So just that it will be positive. So plus, yeah, plus delta pi by t. So I hope that this is clear. Okay. Okay, so let us look at this question. At a point P in a photoelastic material, at point P, in a photoelastic material, the fringe order observed was 5. So n is 5 at point P. The isoclinic parameter at that same point is 30 degrees. So theta at that point P is given to be 30 degrees. The material stress fringe value for this model material is 8 Newton per mm per fringe. So what is given is F sigma is given to be 8 Newton per mm per fringe. The model material's Young's modulus is 2.6 GPa. So E is 2.6 GPa is given, and the Poisson's ratio mu is given to be 0.28. Okay. Before the application of the loads, the thickness of the model was 6 mm. So ideally, I'll take the thickness to be h, let us say. So it is 6 mm initially. And after the application of load, the thickness of P, at that point P, the thickness was measured by a lateral extensometer, which came to H1, which came to 6.01 mm, which means 0.01 mm it increased in thickness. So we have been asked to calculate some values here. So let us look at that. Okay, so the first question says find out the value of principal stress difference sigma 1 minus sigma 2 at that point. So let me just put this over here as a given data. Okay, I'll just erase this. Okay, so this is our given data. So first we should find sigma 1 minus sigma 2. So how to go about that? Now we know that from stress optics law, yeah, we know sigma 1 minus sigma 2 is nf sigma by h. N is 5, sigma f sigma is 8, and this is consistent. This is unitless. H is 6 mm. So sigma 1 minus sigma 2 is nothing but 8 by 6. So it is 6.67. Yeah, exactly. So it is 6.67 units is MPa. Okay, so far so good. So the first one requires us to invoke the stress optic law. Okay, let us look at the second question. Find the value of the normal stress difference sigma x minus sigma y. Okay, so how we can do this? So we can invoke our Moore circle principles. So let us say for a generic case, I'll just draw one more circle. Okay, so this happens to be my, if this happens to be my Moore circle, I know that this is sigma 1, this is sigma 2. So sigma 1 minus sigma 2 is nothing but my diameter of the Moore circle. Center is at sigma 1 plus sigma 2 by 2. Now let us say that it is at some theta p. Uh, let us say my point of interest is this. Okay. And this I would have to rotate it 2 times in the Moore circle in order to get to the principal stress axis. It is given that my principal stress orientation is 30 degrees, which implies that this has to be 60 degrees. The orientation and everything we can take care for a generic problem I'm saying. So this is essentially point P, where if I rotate at point P, if I rotate the stress element by 30 degrees, I'm able to get to the principal stress directions, which means in the Moore circle, I have to rotate it by 60 degrees. Okay, so what is this essentially? At this point, if I see this quantity, it is nothing but tau xy. What will this be? The radius of the Moore circle is it is nothing but sigma 1 minus sigma 2 by 2, right? So sigma 1 minus sigma 2 by 2 implies n f sigma by 2h is my radius of the Moore circle. This is nothing but tau xy at that point, right? So I'm able to see if I were to draw the diagonal here, it would go like that. And at this point, this is sigma x. This ordinate is sigma x. This ordinate is sigma y. So if I call this quantity A, my quantity A is nothing but sigma x minus sigma y by 2 from symmetry arguments, or sigma x minus sigma y is nothing but 2a. Now the question is, what is a and what is tau xy? So I can see that a is nothing but sigma 1 minus sigma 2 I know is nf sigma by h, which implies that this distance I know now. This distance is this. Yeah. So now I know that sigma nf sigma by 2h is the radius of that. Then I can find out a as nf sigma by 2h cos 2 theta p, because theta p is 30 degrees. So nf sigma by h I already got as 6.67 by 2 cos of 60 degrees is my a. So what does this come out to? To cos 60 to 5 by 180 by 2. Right, so it is 1.67 MPa. But we want sigma x minus sigma y, which is nothing but twice this quantity, which is 3.33 MPa. It's, someone had also posted that in the answer. Okay. So what does this tell us? That photoelasticity, once we apply, we are able to get theta p and n. These two quantities come from photoelastic analysis. These two quantities essentially come from our photoelastic analysis of the problem. Once we know that, if using our Mohr circle, we can find the difference in the normal stresses easily. In similar vein, can we find out what tau xy is? From the same arguments, we can see that tau xy from that circle is nothing but nf sigma by 2h sine 2 theta p from that triangle. So nf sigma by 2 is, it is 6.67 by 2 sine 60. So tau xy at that point comes out to be 2 into sine 60. Yeah, 2.88, 2.89 nearly, 89 MPa. Okay, so far so good. So I have been able to find this also, tau xy also. Now they are asking for stress separation. Sigma xx and sigma yy we have to separate out at that point. That cannot be done with photoelastic data alone, which is why there was some measurement that was taken initially. So using the lateral extensometer, they found that the out of plane strain is 6.01. Now this happens to be a thin disc, thin specimen. So with plane stress conditions, we know that our out of plane strain, if I call my plane of analysis to be xy, EZZ I know is sigma z by E minus mu times of sigma x by E minus mu times of sigma y by E. Or this can be written as sigma z by E minus mu by E into sigma x plus sigma y. Now for this planar problem, sigma z is 0. So EZZ is nothing but my mu by E into sigma x plus sigma y at that point, which implies sigma x plus sigma y is minus EZZ into E by mu. Now EZZ do I know? So it changed from 6.01 as opposed to 6 with respect to the original coordinate. So this is my ECC, which is 0.01 by 6. So 1.67 E minus 3 strain units. That is mm per mm, so to speak. In which case I can see that sigma x plus sigma y is nothing but minus 1.67 E3 into E. What was E given to be? 2.6 GPa it is given. So it is nothing but 2.6 E3 MPa by 0.28 is my Poisson's ratio. So what does this come out to be? Sigma x plus sigma y comes out to be into 2.6 E3 by 0.28. So this comes to around minus 15.476 MPa. Okay, so I have the sum of the first invariant I have essentially of the stress tensor, and I also know the difference between the two from my photoelastic analysis, strength of my photoelastic analysis. So if I call this equation 1 and I call this equation 2, so can I solve it to get the difference? Let me copy this here. And equation 2. So we can solve these. There are two unknowns, two equations. So we can essentially solve this 1 minus 1 1 1 into sigma x sigma y is nothing but 3.33 and minus 15.476. So from this we can back calculate sigma x and sigma y. Why don't I just do that? You can also try it out. 3.33 2.476. So I get this as minus 6.073 and minus 9.403 MPa. So I have been able to arrive at the individual stress components. Sigma x, sigma y, tau xy I know now. So what was the requirement from this problem from photoelastic analysis? I was able to get n and I was able to get theta. From these I got sigma 1 minus sigma 2. Subsequently I got sigma x minus sigma y and I was able to get sigma the tau xy. Now the only thing that remains at this point is sigma x and sigma y separately. For that I should go for some method which gives me the sum, which is essentially our by invoking our plane stress condition. It is nothing but the out of plane strain can be related once we know the material properties. So the out of plane displacement if I get, I can get the out of plane strain. Out of plane displacement I measured using an extensometer and I got the total this thing to be 6.01 total measure. So instead of using an extensometer, if I go for optical techniques, we know that holography can provide this thing isopatchics, which are nothing but sigma 1 plus sigma 2. From photoelasticity, we have sigma 1 minus sigma 2, in which case we can separate out the principal stresses and operate only with principal stresses, which is much more efficient than our Cartesian components. So, yes, yeah. So, sigma x, sigma y also we have been able to find out at that point. Okay, so I hope that this is clear. So can you please solve for question number 19? There is no 19 is this is 19, right? Oh, you mean a current assignment? No, actually, current assignments we are not supposed to solve, which is why we took previous year questions and we are solving. So that is a directive we have received the uh, from the organizers. So if there are any questions in that, why don't you ask? I'll try to answer. At least the broad methodology I can tell you. Anyway, I don't have the question with me, and even otherwise, I think fully solving that, I don't think they are entertaining that. But if you have any questions based on the what the doubts are, I'll try to clarify it. What is that question regarding? Yeah. Okay. 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 What are the two formulas you are talking about? Okay. 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 Yes. Yes. Please. And in the meanwhile, Mr. Aragappan, you also see if you can just briefly explain what the question is. I'll try to at least give you some bullets on how it is to be solved. Yeah. Pi dn, pi dh. Okay. No, no. I think sigma 1 minus sigma 2, if you see, for a disk under diameter compression, if you see the stress field equation, and if you consider the center point, which is x equal to 0, y equal to 0, then this will come out to be 8p by pi dt or h or whatever. So this, okay, let me write it h so that it is clear for you. This is nothing but the thickness. Yeah. See, once we have this, we know the left hand side is nothing but nf sigma by h is 8p by pi dh. So h and h cancels out. So essentially f sigma is 8p by pi dn. Huh. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Not for f sigma, fine. But sigma 1 minus sigma 2 you can get from this thing, right? Yes. Essentially it will cancel out. It is also to gauge how much, see, redundant data will always be there. This is a coined problem. Now, if you approach a real problem, you will be given so much of data. You will be getting additional data also. So it is based on our prudence and wisdom as to what we consider and what we know will not help in the analysis. Why not? See, if you are trying to, no, you don't go by formula. You just go by the first principles. Essentially, sigma 1 minus sigma 2 is for a disk at the center point to be the origin. It comes out to be 8p by pi dh. Now, from this route, yeah, from this route, exactly, from this route, you will be able to arrive at sigma 1 minus sigma 2. From stress optic law also, you know sigma 1 minus sigma 2. So you can essentially see how this waters down. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, which is why I said that there would be additional data given, but it is up to your, yes, we should, it is up to our acumen to gauge what is required and what is not, what is redundant. Okay. Yeah, yeah, not a problem. Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir. Mr. Raja Aragappan, you have any question? I mean, I cannot solve that particular question, but if you just give me a brief of what it was, I'll try to at least give you some bullets. Okay. Anyway, that I'll have to clarify it. But what is that question regarding? Well, because I don't have it readily with me. Okay. 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 Right. Yes. Yes. F sigma. No, F sigma is not a stress concentration factor. Essentially, F sigma is material stress fringe value. SCF is stress concentration factor, right? So if you see, I'll just briefly just touch upon it. If you see a plate with a hole, essentially when we apply the stress, let us say my far field stress is some sigma. Okay, at this point, how we solve this in uh, theory of elasticity is we will consider another disk, because for an annular disk we have the closed form solution. This annular disk we will consider it, and we will take its radius, the radius to be infinity. We'll set it at far field and we will say the stress field is applied like that. By doing this, what we will essentially get is our, at this point, let me consider this point. Okay. At that point, if I were to draw the stress element, I'm able to see that the inner surface of the hole is a free surface, in which case my sigma r, it doesn't exist. Okay, and being a free surface, shear also doesn't exist, which implies that at this point A, let me call that point A, and at point A, if I draw the stress element, I'll be left only with one type of stress, which is nothing but sigma theta theta. Okay, because sigma r doesn't exist from free surface arguments, and shear also doesn't exist. This happens to be the free surface. This is the free surface. On this free surface, sigma r is not there, sigma r theta is not there. If sigma r theta is not there here, naturally in other phases also, by equality of complementary shears, that will also not exist. So essentially only sigma theta theta exists. Now if you see the derivation in any standard book for theory of elasticity, we will be able to see that it will be sigma into 1 minus cos 2 theta, something like that. Okay, so it's a cos variation. So when I get theta equal to 0, let me say theta is 0. What will happen here? Cos 2 theta is, it will be actually 2 cos 2 theta. Okay, you just verify this once again. Okay, what it waters down to exactly, I'm not remembering. But essentially what will happen is at sigma equal to theta, we are talking about point A, right? So the cos of 0 is 1. So it will be uh, sigma theta theta at that point. 1 minute. Sigma theta theta at theta equal to 0 would be sigma into 1 minus 2, which is nothing but minus sigma. Actually, the coordinate system will be the other way around. Essentially, if I have So the coordinate system will be like this. Okay. So this will be theta equal to 0. At point A, theta will be equal to 90 degree. I am telling you from what I remember. You can revisit this. Essentially, this is how it will be solved. So what this implies is, let me call this point B. Okay. Let me call this point B. So at point B, at B, theta is equal to 0, which implies sigma theta theta there is minus theta. So this shows something interesting. When I pull a specimen, just because of the presence of a hole, I am having compression of equal magnitude there. At the same time, at point A, theta is equal to 90 degrees, right? So cos 2 theta is cos 180, which means it is minus 1. So what we will be able to see is sigma theta theta will be 3 times of the far field stress. So our stress concentration factor is nothing but our stress at that point, the maximum stress divided by the far field stress. This is how we have to approach that problem. Is it clear, sir? Okay. So with this so with this understanding, you just approach it once again, and if there are any questions, you bring it up in the next session. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if there are no further questions, so I'll call it a day. Thank you for attending. I'll see you next week on Monday. So thanks. I hope this session was useful. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.